Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, a title held, of course, by his late father, Prince Philip, for more than 70 years. It had been the late Prince's wish for Prince Edward to be granted the dukedom after his death.
For generations, royal titles followed a simple rule. They passed from father to son. But in recent years, that rule has quietly been broken, and it has created a complicated situation inside the monarchy. At the center of it is Prince Edward, a royal holding a title that will not pass to his own son, while another title is shared between them in an unusual way. With tradition shifting and questions growing about the future, many are now looking toward the plans of King Charles III. So how did it come to this, and what happens next? Join us as we break down the full story. The title nobody expected him to choose. If there is anything the royal house has taught us, it is that the most difficult stories are not understood from the surface. Rather, they are understood when you look beyond the announcements themselves and focus on the timing, the structure, and the quiet decisions that sit underneath what is publicly stated. In this case, it all started in 1999, when Prince Edward married Sophie Rhys-Jones at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. Everyone assumed he would receive a dukedom. That was the tradition. That was what his brothers had received. Prince Charles had become the Prince of Wales and Duke of Cornwall. Prince Andrew had become the Duke of York. Edward was next. The dukedom was ready. The expectation was not speculative. It was almost automatic within public understanding of how royal marriages of senior princes were treated. A dukedom signified status, hierarchy, and continuity within the royal structure. And then the palace announced something nobody had expected. Edward would not be a duke. He would be an earl. Specifically, the Earl of Wessex. And the reason behind that choice, according to reports that surfaced after the wedding, was one of the most unusual origin stories in modern royal history. Edward had reportedly become drawn to the title after watching the 1998 film Shakespeare in Love, in which the character Lord Wessex is played by Colin Firth. The idea that a royal title could be influenced by a film character was unusual enough that it immediately stood out in public discussion. A future British duke chose his first royal title because of a character in a period drama about an Elizabethan playwright. That is not the kind of detail that gets written into official palace statements. But it is the kind of detail that is very difficult to make up, and because of that, it has remained part of the wider conversation surrounding the decision ever since. Whether it was the defining reason or simply a contributing influence has never been formally clarified, but the association between the title and the film has persisted in commentary and reporting. So Edward became the Earl of Wessex, and Sophie became the Countess of Wessex. And alongside that announcement came a promise. Buckingham Palace confirmed that the plan, agreed between Queen Elizabeth, Prince Philip, and the Prince of Wales, was that Edward would eventually receive the Dukedom of Edinburgh. The title was held by his father, one of the most prestigious and historically significant titles in the entire royal family. But not yet. Not while Philip was alive. Not while the Queen was on the throne. The promise would be kept in due course, but the timing was intentionally left open, tied to future succession and circumstance rather than immediate appointment. That course took 24 years. During that time, Edward and Sophie gradually expanded their public roles, carrying out engagements and supporting charities while maintaining a relatively steady presence within the working structure of the monarchy. They were not at the center of royal attention in the same way as some other members of the family, but they became consistent figures within their public duties. The promised transition, however, remained in the background, unchanged but not forgotten. Philip died in April 2021. The Queen died in September 2022. And on 10th March 2023, Edward's 59th birthday, King Charles III formally conferred the Dukedom of Edinburgh on his younger brother. Edward became a duke. Sophie became a duchess. Their son James, who had been styled Viscount Severn, became the Earl of Wessex as a courtesy title. The promise was kept. The titles had moved, and almost immediately, the legal questions began to surface. Because the way Charles gave Edward the dukedom was not straightforward, and that decision is the root of everything happening now. So keep watching. When King Charles gave Edward the dukedom of Edinburgh in 2023, he gave it as a life peerage. That detail is what most people missed. And it is the detail that matters most when understanding the future of the title. A life peerage, in practical terms, is held by one individual and does not pass to descendants. It is personal, not dynastic. When Edward dies, the dukedom of Edinburgh will not automatically pass to James. It will return to the crown, cease to exist in its current form, and can only be recreated at the discretion of a future monarch. That stands in direct contrast to the earldom of Wessex, which Edward has held since 1999. The earldom is a hereditary peerage, which means it follows the traditional line of succession. It will pass to James when Edward dies. James will inherit it formally and become the substantive Earl of Wessex in his own right, not just as a courtesy title holder. He will also inherit the earldom of Forfar, which Queen Elizabeth granted Edward in 2019. Both of these titles will continue through the family line in the traditional way. The dukedom will not. And that creates a structure that is unusual in modern royal arrangements. One title continues through inheritance across generations. The other ends with a single life. Both exist within the same family at the same time, operating under two different systems of continuity, one permanent and one temporary. Right now, in 2026, the situation looks like this. Edward holds the dukedom of Edinburgh and the earldom of Wessex simultaneously. One is a life-based title. The other is hereditary. James currently uses the title Earl of Wessex as a courtesy, because as the eldest son of a duke, he is entitled to use the next highest title within his father's portfolio. This creates a unique overlap, where both father and son are connected to the same title at the same time, but in different legal and social capacities. The father holds it formally. The son uses it by convention. When Edward dies, the dukedom of Edinburgh will cease. James will then formally inherit the earldom of Wessex, and the courtesy title he has been using will become an actual hereditary title. That transition is straightforward in principle, but still requires formal confirmation in practice, because the structure of overlapping titles must be carefully recorded and adjusted within the peerage system. And it is more complicated than it sounds, because there is another layer sitting underneath all of it that most people have never heard about. Stay with us. The title that was never meant to be given, and the legal angle. In 1917, King George V issued letters patent that established which members of the royal family were entitled to use the style of His or Her Royal Highness and the titles of Prince or Princess. Under those letters patent, all grandchildren of a British monarch in the male line are entitled to His Royal Highness and the royal titles. That means James Mountbatten Windsor, as the son of Edward, who is the son of a monarch, is legally entitled right now to style himself His Royal Highness Prince James of Edinburgh. He always has been. The entitlement never went away. It was simply never used. Edward and Sophie made a deliberate decision when their children were born to raise them without royal titles. They wanted James and his sister Lady Louise to grow up as normally as possible, with the option to take up their titles when they turned 18 if they chose to. Sophie confirmed this publicly in a 2020 interview, saying that both children have them and can decide to use them from 18, but I think it's highly unlikely. James turned 18 in December 2025. He did not take up the HRH. He did not make any move toward it. Sources close to the family describe that as entirely consistent with his character and his upbringing, and there was no expectation that he would change his position. But here is where the legal layer becomes important, and where Edward's lawyers enter the story in a very specific way. Because in formalizing the structure of Edward's current titles, they cannot treat James as simply a private individual with no royal standing. The legal framework does not allow that. His Royal Highness entitlement exists on paper under the 1917 Letters Patent, whether it is used or not. It is not symbolic. It is not conditional. It is a standing constitutional entitlement that has simply been left dormant. That creates a complication that is not political and not personal, but procedural. Any legal documentation that sets out the full structure of Edward's dukedom and the hereditary earldom beneath it has to acknowledge that James exists in three overlapping positions at once. First, as the courtesy Earl of Wessex. Second, as the future substantive holder of the hereditary earldom of Wessex and Forfar. And third, as an individual who is entitled under constitutional rules to his Royal Highness Prince status, even though he has chosen not to activate it. This is where royal legal practice becomes very precise. In most cases, these categories never overlap in a way that requires detailed reconciliation. Members of the royal family either actively use their titles, or they are formally removed from them through clear constitutional steps. But James sits in a rare middle position where nothing has been removed, nothing has been activated, and everything remains legally available but practically unused. Royal legal experts have described situations like this as inactive entitlement structures, where rights exist but are not exercised, yet still must be accounted for in official record-keeping. It is not about public identity. It is about constitutional accuracy. The Crown Office, the College of Arms, and royal legal advisors do not work only with what is used. They work with what is legally possible, even if it remains dormant for an entire lifetime. So when Edward's lawyers began formally confirming the structure of his titles, the His Royal Highness entitlement could not simply be ignored. It had to be acknowledged in the background framework of documentation, not because James is expected to use it, and not because there is any intention for him to change his position, but because the legal architecture of the monarchy does not allow silent exceptions. Everything must either be used, removed, or recorded as existing but inactive. That is where the complication sits, and it is why this situation is being described by constitutional commentators as unusual, not because it is controversial, but because it requires multiple layers of royal law to be read together at the same time. The peerage system, the letters patent system, and the internal rules of courtesy titles are all operating simultaneously in one family line in a way that rarely happens at this level of visibility. But even that is not the most important part of the story. Because underneath the legal structure, there is still the question of timing, and whether Edward's dukedom was always meant to function this way from the beginning. Before the current legal situation can be fully understood, there is a chapter in this story that most coverage has glossed over. The dukedom of Edinburgh very nearly did not happen at all. When Prince Philip died in April 2021, the title of Duke of Edinburgh passed automatically to Charles as the eldest son. When Charles became king in September 2022, it merged with the crown and ceased to exist. At that point, it was Charles's decision entirely whether to recreate it and give it to Edward. And for a significant period, the signs pointed toward no. In July 2021, The Times reported that Charles had decided not to give the Edinburgh dukedom to his brother. Clarence House did not deny the story. Royal commentators noted that Edward had been steadily increasing his workload, taking on responsibilities that had previously been distributed among other working royals, particularly during periods of transition and controversy within the wider family. The reaction to the report was immediate and unusually strong for an internal royal matter. Many observers argued that Edward had become one of the most stable working members of the family, particularly through his long association with the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, which had been one of Prince Philip's defining legacies. The idea that he would not inherit the title felt, to many, like a break from continuity, rather than a continuation of it. There was also a broader institutional concern forming in the background. According to reporting by royal correspondents, there were discussions within palace circles about whether granting the Dukedom of Edinburgh to Edward would have wider constitutional implications, particularly in relation to Scotland. The title itself carries significant symbolic weight in Scottish public life, and any decision involving it was being considered carefully in the context of evolving political sentiment. It was only later, after the resignation of Nicola Sturgeon and a shift in the immediate political momentum surrounding Scottish independence debates, that the broader environment changed enough for the decision to move forward. By March 2023, the conditions were different. The concerns had not disappeared, but they had settled into a less immediate position. And on Edward's 59th birthday, the announcement came. The promise that had been made in 1999 was finally kept. But it was kept in a way that did something more subtle at the same time. It ensured that the title would not simply continue as part of a straightforward hereditary line. Instead, it was structured in a way that contained its own endpoint, and that is the part that connects everything happening now to the future of the monarchy. So keep watching, because this story is far from over. The real reason. The Duke of Edinburgh was made a peerage. The decision to create the Dukedom of Edinburgh as a life peerage rather than a hereditary one was not accidental. It was deliberate, and it was connected to a conversation about the future of the monarchy that goes well beyond Edward and his family. Because when Edward dies and the dukedom returns to the crown, the title does not simply disappear. It waits. And who it waits for is the part of this story that has generated the most discussion in royal circles. According to palace sources cited in reporting from late 2022, the leading candidate for an eventual recreation of the Dukedom of Edinburgh is Princess Charlotte. Charlotte is currently second in line to the throne behind her father, Prince William, and her brother, Prince George. She is a senior member of the direct line of succession, with a public role that will only grow as she gets older. And conferring the Dukedom of Edinburgh on her at some future point would carry enormous symbolic weight. Think about what that would mean. The title that was created for Prince Philip in 1947 when he married Princess Elizabeth, that passed to Charles in 2021, that was recreated for Edward in 2023, would one day belong to the granddaughter of the woman it was originally created to honor. The title Duchess of Edinburgh, a courtesy style held by the Queen herself before she ascended the throne, would return to the female line. It would belong to a woman who is second in line to be queen. The history and the symbolism of that moment, if it happens, would be considerable. Making the current creation a life peerage was the mechanism that makes this possible. Had Charles given Edward the title as a hereditary dukedom, it would have passed to James and then through James's descendants, and Charlotte would have no claim to it. By creating it as a life peerage, Charles effectively preserved the title for William to give to Charlotte when the time comes. The legal architecture that Edward's lawyers are currently navigating is, in part, what ensures that future outcome remains possible. This is the slimmed-down monarchy in action, titles held with purpose, not accumulated by birthright, and pointed toward the future shape of the institution, rather than the comfort of the present generation. But it doesn't end there. Edward and Sophie, the royals who stepped up when others stepped back. There is one more piece of this story that makes the title situation even more meaningful when you see the full picture. It is easy to focus only on the legal structure of peerages, the timing of announcements, or the technical detail of how titles are passed or restricted. But none of that exists in isolation. It sits on top of a very specific period in recent royal history, one that changed the shape of the institution itself and quietly increased the importance of the individuals who remained working within it. In the years between 2020 and 2023, the working royal family shrank considerably. Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties in January 2020. Andrew was formally removed from public duties in November 2021 following the fallout from his connections to Jeffrey Epstein. That left King Charles, Queen Camilla, Prince William, Princess Catherine, Princess Anne, and Edward and Sophie carrying the bulk of the institution's public-facing work. What had once been a wider, more distributed structure became noticeably narrower, and the demands on those who remained increased almost immediately. Edward and Sophie did not complain about this. They did not give interviews about the increased burden. They did not attempt to reposition themselves publicly or use the moment to negotiate for a higher profile within the institution. Instead, Prince Edward and Sophie simply absorbed the change. They took on more engagements, traveled further, represented the king in more places, and kept the machinery of royal duty functioning at a time when it was under visible strain from multiple directions. Their work was not framed by publicity, but by consistency, and that consistency became more noticeable precisely because others had stepped back or been removed. Sophie in particular received quiet but significant praise within royal circles for the way she handled the expanded role. Her approach was described by those close to the institution as steady, unshowy, and reliable in moments where the public attention on the monarchy was often intense and unpredictable. There was no attempt to turn that praise into personal elevation or public advantage. It remained within the structure of duty itself, which is part of what makes it notable in hindsight. That context makes the Edinburgh title story even more significant when viewed in full. These are not royals who built their position through public competition or internal pressure. They are not figures who forced structural change or created tension around status. They are royals who worked continuously within the system as it was given to them, without using moments of institutional weakness to reposition themselves. The title Edward received in 2023 was not given early, and it was not given easily. It was given after more than 2 decades of waiting, after uncertainty about whether it would happen at all, and in a form that deliberately limited its permanence within his family line. And Edward, characteristically, accepted it without public friction and continued with his duties. There was no attempt to reshape the announcement into something larger than what it was. No public framing beyond the formal structure of the grant itself. In many ways, that reaction is as important as the title structure itself, because it reinforces the pattern that has defined his role for decades: continuity over visibility, function over prominence, and acceptance over negotiation. James and Lady Louise have followed that same approach in their own way, though under very different circumstances. Lady Louise has been seen working at a garden center and studying at St. Andrews University, the same university where Prince William and Catherine met. Her life has remained largely outside the royal spotlight, shaped by education and work rather than formal public duties. James, now 18, shows no interest in royal titles or public royal life. Despite being legally entitled to His Royal Highness under the 1917 letters patent, he has not chosen to use it. That entitlement remains available, but unused, sitting in the background of his legal identity rather than defining it. Both children have grown up knowing they could use His Royal Highness title if they chose to. Both have chosen not to. In a royal family that has, at various points in recent history, seen members actively challenge, question, or step away from the structures of title and duty, that restraint stands out. It is not dramatic restraint, and it is not publicly performed restraint. It is simply the absence of interest in a system that has defined previous generations in much more visible ways. And in a quieter sense, that may be the most significant continuation of all, because it reflects not only how Edward and Sophie have approached their roles, but how the next generation is choosing to interpret what those roles mean. In a system built on visibility, inheritance, and defined status, the most notable pattern here may be the absence of urgency around any of it. What comes next for this branch of the family? So where does all of this leave things now? The lawyers are working through the formal documentation of the double title situation. The process of confirming what happens to the earldom of Wessex when Edward dies how James formally assumes the substantive title, and how the unused His Royal Highness entitlement is handled in the legal paperwork is ongoing. None of it is urgent in the immediate sense, because Prince Edward is 62 years old and in good health. But royal legal situations of this kind require proactive management, not reactive response, and that is what is happening. For James, the picture is relatively straightforward once the formalities are worked through. He will inherit the earldom of Wessex and the earldom of Forfar. He will not inherit the dukedom of Edinburgh. He will have the option to use His Royal Highness Prince James until he dies, but he has shown no inclination to do so. He will, in all likelihood, live a life that is connected to the royal family by blood and by title, but not defined by either. His parents worked hard to give him that option. He appears to have taken it. For the dukedom of Edinburgh itself, the picture points toward the future. When Edward dies, the title returns to the crown. At that point, King William will have the freedom to recreate it for Princess Charlotte, if he chooses to do so. That decision will depend on the political climate, the state of the Scottish question, Charlotte's own public role by that point, and the shape of the working royal family at the time. None of those things can be predicted with certainty right now, but the legal architecture that makes it possible has been deliberately built. The door is open. Whether Charlotte walks through it is a question for a future reign. What is happening right now through Edward's lawyers and their confirmation of the double title process is the responsible management of a genuinely unusual legal situation. It is not chaos in the dramatic sense, but it is complex. It is the kind of complexity that arises when a promise made in 1999 is kept in 2023 in a way that was designed to serve the institution's future rather than simply reward one family. And it is the kind of complexity that reveals, when you follow every thread, how carefully the slimmed-down monarchy is being constructed. Not just in terms of who shows up to public events, but in terms of who holds what titles, for how long, and for what purpose. So what do you think? Should the Dukedom of Edinburgh eventually pass to Princess Charlotte? And do you think Edward and Sophie have handled their royal roles in a way that deserves more recognition than they have received? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. And click the next video on your screen. You won't want to miss what comes next.